Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Good to see you all here. My name is Nienke de Haan. I'm a programmer. I work for Studium Generale, Utrecht University's platform for knowledge and reflection. And I'm curious to hear, please raise your hand, who's been to Studium Generale before? Oh, many of you. That's great. Good to have you back. For people who haven't been here before, welcome. We organize about 2 to 3 public lectures and events each week. And I'm very glad you're all here tonight for the last event of our season. This is the 5th and last evening in a lecture series on war and peace. And tonight's question is not an easy one. How to get justice for war crimes. We've got 2 guests tonight. First, historian Dr Iva Vukušić, who will give a lecture on the power of criminal courts and tribunals in addressing international injustice. And after the lecture, I will talk with political anthropologist Dr Ewa Strzelecka about what justice means for people on the ground. She's an expert on Yemen. The UN has called the war that has been raging there for 8 years the greatest humanitarian disaster of our time. And I was wondering, why has no one been convicted for it yet? And what does justice in this conflict look like? At the end of the night, there will also be time for questions and comments from the audience. And if you're watching online, please join by popping your questions in the chat. So let me start with introducing our first guest. She's an assistant professor in international history at Utrecht University and a visiting research fellow at the Department of War Studies, King's College London. She's a historian and a genocide scholar specialized in mass violence and transitional justice, especially criminal accountability. Before coming to The Hague in 2009, she spent 3 years in Sarajevo, where she worked as a researcher and analyst at the Special Department for War Crimes at the Office of the Prosecutor. Please give a warm applause to Dr. Iva Vukušić.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Excellent. Let me just place this elegantly into my pocket. So, goedenavond allemaal. Leuk dat jullie alle hier zijn. Is dat goed genoeg? So welcome everyone. It's my real joy and honor and pleasure to be giving the talk this evening on this very important and topical subject, how to get justice for war crimes. Before we begin, maybe just a very small note. I've spent 4 hours today teaching, and even though it doesn't look like very much, it's actually quite tiring and draining, so I'm not to the same level full of energy as I would love to be for this event. So if you see me in one moment just losing my thought for a second or just taking 1 second longer to answer your questions, please be kind and gracious about it. Because as I said, teaching doesn't look like very much. It doesn't look like very difficult, hard labor, but it actually takes a lot of concentration. So at the end of the day, after a day of teaching, we tend to be a little bit tired. So that said, let me get into it. I hope my pace of speech is adequate. Sometimes I speak a little bit fast. So if you notice the same thing this evening, just raise your hand, interrupt me, and I'll happily oblige and speak a little bit slower. So how to get justice for war crimes. My talk this evening is going to be guided by 3 main questions. One is, what is the international justice system? This is something, of course, that we see in the news quite a lot. We hear about courts and tribunals. We ask questions about justice in this context or in that one. So our purpose this evening is to think a little bit about these institutions and to try to figure out what the system really is. The second question that I want to be discussing is, what are some of the biggest challenges to this international justice system? I'm sure many of you read the news and think about this, so you probably have some ideas, but I will offer some of my thoughts. And then finally, the third question that I would like to discuss this evening is about what can be done to improve the system. What can we as citizens do, or how we can act in order to potentially support international justice. Now, before we continue, I just want to say, of course, in the introduction, it was made clear that I'm an assistant professor in international history, so I'm a historian, I'm a genocide scholar, and I used to work in practice. So before ever beginning my academic career, I used to work in Sarajevo, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in The Hague, in war crimes trials. So a lot of the things that I will talk about also come from my practical experience in this world. But I think it's also important to say that I'm also a client of international justice. So originally I come from Zagreb, from Croatia, which is the former Yugoslavia, which some of the older ones among you might remember from the early 1990s. My country fell apart in violence. So in some ways, I'm also a client. I'm also someone who this international justice system is supposed to serve, or was supposed to serve. So this is the perspective that I will be taking, one of a scholar, of a practitioner, but also in some ways of a client of international justice. So let's just begin by stating something that is probably quite obvious to many of you, which is that the needs for justice are truly great. And when I say great, we can think of examples from Ukraine, Israel and Palestine, Syria, Ethiopia, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, and many other places. In each of those conflicts, as was the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, there are potentially hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals who are maybe implicated in some kind of illegal violations and some kind of crimes. I know that when I worked in Bosnia, we had several thousand people on a list of potential individuals who were potentially had to be investigated because maybe they were implicated in war crimes. So here I think it's really important to understand that these needs are so great that no system can ever truly, fully deliver justice and prosecute every single person that should be prosecuted. That is simply not possible. I often say this to my students. The criminal justice system, the international justice system, is designed in a way that it can only really capture a few cases. So we can get to that also, of course, in the Q&A. But violence against civilians remains prevalent across the world. And therefore, these kinds of questions remain crucial for us to try to answer. However, one thing I think is really important for all of us to realize is that war, as such, is not illegal. War, there are rules about how it can be fought. There are rules about how an attack can be legal, what are the circumstances that make an attack legal, or starting a war. There are also rules about how to fight war, so what is allowed and what is not allowed. For example, it's allowed to, be a soldier and shoot at other soldiers, but it's not allowed, for example, to kill a prisoner of war when they are what we would call hors de combat, so outside of combat, without arms, for example. So it's really about regulating how and under what circumstances wars can be fought. So what I think is really important to take away is that the international justice system is not a blueprint for a just world. It is merely a disaster management instrument. So once a war breaks out, the international justice system is there to try to prevent the very worst behavior. Sadly, it's not able to do much more than that. So which crimes we're going to be talking about for the next 15 minutes or so? First, war crimes. This is something that we hear a lot about, of course. This is the serious violations of the war and customs of war. It comes from the Geneva Conventions, the legacy of the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. We also, of course, have crimes against humanity, murder, persecution, with these attacks that are part of what we would call widespread and systematic attacks. And finally, of course, we have genocide. This is defined in the UN Genocide Convention. There's several of my students here in the audience. They, I'm sure, know well what the definition we're talking about. But here, of course, the genocide as a crime is defined with its purpose to destroy. So the perpetrators want to destroy, in whole or in part, one of the 4 protected groups: national, ethnic, racial, or religious. So it's a very defined, prescribed set of crimes that we're talking about. And all of my comments tonight are about individual criminal responsibility. So I'm going to be talking about all the courts and tribunals, or well, some of them, given that I have such a short time, that deal with individuals. So this is not going to be about the responsibility of states. It's going to be about the responsibility of individuals and their participation or perpetration of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. So even though we're talking about the international justice system, what I want to say is there really isn't much of a system here. It's a set of different institutions that work in some ways toward a joint goal, but it's not in any way an organized, integrated sort of a system. Basically, it's a host of institutions, a list of institutions that emerged in the aftermath of the Cold War. In the early 1990s, the first international tribunal that was formed was, here you see the acronym ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That was the first contemporary international tribunal, which was followed the year later, so 1993, 1994, the Tribunal for Rwanda was established. And then after that, different what we call hybrid courts came. These are courts that are normally established between, for example, the United Nations and a certain country, like Cambodia. Maybe some of you have heard of trials there. So it's really a bunch of separate institutions that are all in some way trying to address this legacy of mass violence. So this system, to simplify, has been operational for 20, 30 years, but really at its core is the International Criminal Court, which again is an institution that I think many of you have seen discussed also in the media. The International Criminal Court has been now working for about 20 years. It has 123 state parties, so 123 states participate, but some very important states do not. So Russia, China, the United States are not members of the ICC. So some critiques of the International Criminal Court, but also more broadly this system, is that it focuses on weak states. For example, the critique for the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is that it focuses on African states, and it doesn't often go after cases that important, powerful Western states would be uncomfortable with, so to say. For example, Afghanistan, Iraq, the situation in Israel and Gaza right now. So all of these cases that are considered to be difficult politically or touchy for powerful Western states, the perception and the critique is that the international justice system and the International Criminal Court at its center doesn't go there. So this is the International Criminal Court. It's, of course, as we all know, seated in The Hague. This is the court that is independent, so it's not part of the United Nations, and it has 123 state parties and deals with individuals. It's not this. What often happens is when you read the newspapers, you often hear and see titles, the ICC does X, and then this is the picture. This is not the ICC. This is the International Court of Justice, which is a UN institution and deals with responsibility between states. So I always tell my students, if it looks like a castle, it's not the ICC. So that can be your golden rule. If it looks like a castle, then you know it's not the International Criminal Court. So just to briefly discuss some of the biggest challenges. So first is the very basic question of how do you provide justice for a ruined life? A dead husband, a dead child, a murdered brother, a murdered husband, daughter, wife. It almost is too difficult to imagine what justice in those kinds of situations would mean. People speak about their lives being ruined, their pets killed, their houses, everything they ever owned is gone. How do you provide, as an institution, how do you provide justice for that? The court, of course, and here we're talking about the International Criminal Court, doesn't have jurisdiction, so it doesn't have the legal authority to act wherever it wants. It's actually really narrow in where it can go. So it can go into the states that are members, or in places where, for example, a citizen of these states has perpetrated a crime. But it can't go and act anywhere that it wants. What I think is really important is that the International Criminal Court is actually not a very strong institution. It is fully and absolutely dependent on state support. It has no police of its own. It has no independent funding. All the money the court gets are from its member states. If it needs someone arrested, a state police has to do it because the ICC has no police of its own. So we speak of this as like this very important institution, but it's actually quite weak on its own and depends on all of these other actors, mainly states, to support it. And of course, states know about this power that they have, and then they try to influence in different ways the court and kind of nudge it to look at certain situations, but maybe to turn away in some other ones. When it does intervene, however, I think the expectations should really be kept to a fairly humble sort of level. Because if you think about, for example, the crimes in Ukraine now, you know, almost 2 years since the full-scale invasion, almost a decade since the first attacks, thousands and thousands and thousands of people killed, detained, tortured, raped, murdered, their houses looted. There's no way the International Criminal Court, even in the best case scenario, would be able to prosecute more than 3 people, 5, maybe 10. So it's always necessarily a very small contribution that such institutions can do. And they're very focused, specific crime, specific village, specific day. And when we do see trials, they last years. Investigations are very long. I used to work at the Yugoslavia tribunal when the Mladic and Karadzic cases were going on. So these are Bosnian Serb leaders that were at the end convicted for genocide and other crimes and are serving lifelong sentences. Their cases, both of them, were 5 years long, almost 600 witnesses. So it's slow, it's imperfect, and as I said, it only really is a solution in only just a few sort of cases. So what can't the court do? The court doesn't do anything to stop wars, really. It's not its job. I sometimes tell my students, if you want the court to stop wars, it's almost like going to the dentist and then asking for a haircut. It's simply not the right address for that. It probably has very little effect to deterring or preventing alleged perpetrators from maybe committing some crimes in the future, because perpetrators know the chances of you landing in court are so slim that actually it's not a very realistic threat. It does not restore lives to where they were. It doesn't return anyone's family members. It doesn't put you back to where you were. It doesn't improve lives in any measurable, clearly visible way. Also, you know, even when it is at its best, courts provide some justice to some people some of the time. So it's really very limited. They can't provide jobs. They can't make sure that there's political representation. They can't, have access to education all of a sudden be available to everyone. So I'm aware that my story is kind of a bleak one, and that I'm giving you all the things that the court doesn't do or can't be expected to do, because it's not a magic wand, and it's a flawed institution, but it's all we've got. We have no other system. So I think here it's important to realize that as flawed as it is, there is an opportunity in us having a system at all. And then just finally, as we are kind of getting to the closing, is that, so what can be done to improve this? What can citizens do to improve this one flawed system that we have? I would say one crucial thing is to stay informed about wars and violence and abuses of civilians, because abuses often happen in the darkness. Abuses often happen when no one's looking, or, something else comes up and then everyone turns away and looks at something else, and then everyone was looking at Ukraine for 18 months and now it's vanished. from our news cycles, or almost vanished. And now everyone is looking at Israel and Gaza, and in 2 months, we're going to be looking at something else. So keep attention to things, because abuses happen in darkness. Demand attention to these issues from our leaders. Demand moral courage, and expect the same standards everywhere, applied equally in each situation, no matter who is involved. So we're all citizens of some countries. I'm the citizen of both Croatia and the Netherlands. I can demand my governments to act in a way that is principled and impartial, and that doesn't fall victim to kind of daily political considerations. There is no excuse for war crimes, there's no benefit of it, and there's no reason to tolerate them. So I would really encourage citizens, and also looking at myself, to reject hypocrisy from wealthy Western states, which want to be playing by different rules, where it's one rules for you and another rule for me. I think that is really dangerous, because a system that is hypocritical is a system that can't last and won't have any legitimacy, because ultimately double standards are not standards, and then people around the world will see through that. And the system that we have invested time and effort, and the Netherlands has invested a lot of money in as well in the last 2 or 3 decades by supporting these different courts. I think this hypocrisy is definitely harming the system and any legitimacy that it might have around the world. But my talk being fairly bleak, I do want to say that there is some hope, though, because there is a budding system. There are some institutions that are trying to do some work. So as imperfect as it is a small miracle that we have anything. If we had to start from scratch now, I'm not sure that any international criminal court would be established. So I'm always very much encouraging us to try to see the system for what it is, or the set of institutions for what it is, which is flawed, politicized, and with a lot of problems. But again, there's something there that we can work on and that we can try to improve. And just as the main takeaways, I guess, is that the international justice system is not really a system, truly speaking, just yet. The International Criminal Court that sort of stands at the center of it, it's weak and depends on political support. This support then depends on state interests. It tends to not be based in principle. So far, international justice seems to be going much more after the weak and not the strong. If we want to make the system better, and again, it's all we've got, so we don't have anything else sort of right behind the corner waiting for us, we must demand better, fairer politics from our leaders and less hypocrisy and double standards. And finally, it's justice for all equally, or the system loses any legitimacy and dies. And I would say now is really the time to demand a better system. Thank you very much.
Eva, thank you so much for your very clear story. I'm sure there will be many questions later on from the audience. I've got a question for you now. I've heard you say it's double standards or no standards, and at the moment it gives some justice for some people in some cases. Mm-hmm. Is there any way you could see the ICC become more powerful, or what could we do to strengthen its position?
Well, as I said, it's really difficult for the ICC to become more powerful by itself, because its funding
comes
from
states, and it doesn't have any.
So I think ultimately what we need to do is all of us citizens to demand better politics and more principled politics from our states, which are then the Netherlands as part of the International Criminal Court, is also the host country, so as such has a strong voice, to demand the same kind of clarity in all the cases, the same kind of decisiveness about investigations being needed in all different kinds of cases. And I'm afraid that that's not necessarily what we're seeing.
Yeah, and is that a case for citizens, or could we also make sure it would have its own funding, or that would not be possible?
That would be great, but I don't see it happening. So it's a limitation that is outlined sort of in the court's design. So while I think it would be great if it would happen, I think it's not very likely to happen anytime soon, that the court is funded completely independently, that the states have nothing to do with that.
Yeah. And you gave a really realistic, I think, view of what it looked like in Sarajevo, like getting many cases, and you don't have the power to deal with all of them. What would What would we need to make that more fair? Would it need a lot more money or a lot more people? Or
I think that's a very good question, and it goes really to the core of what we imagine justice to be, and international justice to be. I think the system will never be able to prosecute, even if it's the best funded, most wonderfully designed. You will never be able to prosecute 200,000 rapists and murderers a year across the world. That's simply, it's not a realistic kind of an idea, I think. So fundamentally, I think what we need to do is be much more clear about which cases we have to prosecute. So this is absolutely, there's a set of criteria, we have to prosecute these cases. These other ones will probably never reach a courtroom, but then we may have to make sure that there's other mechanisms to provide some justice or some repair. So psychosocial support, for example, for survivors, all kinds of things that have to do with education and sort of job prospects, so that we don't hang all of our hopes on the international justice system because it can't handle that. So to try to diversify some of the mechanisms that we're working with, and I guess try to have some positive change in that respect, because there's no way that any system will be able to provide justice for all the mass violence, sort of war crimes, genocide that we see across the world. Sadly, it's simply too much.
Thank you.
No problem.
One more applause, please.
Thank you.
At the end of the evening, we can also discuss some current events maybe, and I'm very curious to hear also what all of you are wondering about. One of the questions that came to my mind when reading the news the past 2 years was also how does it come that this international community and the international criminal justice system acts very quick in some cases and very slow in others. As said, the war in Yemen has been going on for quite some time. We've seen terrible things happening there, and yet no one has been convicted for it yet. So I thought it would be interesting to dive deeper as well into a war we don't hear much about and see what justice in this conflict looks like. Our second guest tonight is a political anthropologist working at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. She specialized in Yemen and more specifically on the role women play in peace processes. Please give a warm applause to Dr. Ewa Strzelecka. I'll take this one.
Okay.
Ewa, welcome.
Good evening.
Good to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, great. As I just said, at least I don't hear a lot about Yemen in the news. It's also very hard for journalists to reach Yemen, I've understood. You have been there as a researcher, and you are in contact with many people there, also from there, people who are in exile now, living in the Netherlands. So I think it's quite special you're here today and share with us the perspective from within, and I would like to delve a bit deeper with you into what justice means for people on the ground. We've just heard Eva talk about the ICC. Maybe let's just start with that. Yemen is one of those countries where the ICC can't do much, right? Because they're not a member.
Yes, that's true. So Yemen never ratified Rome status, but there is also another problem that Saudi-led coalition that is involved in the war. Most countries in that coalition also didn't ratify the Rome status. So ICC in this case has very limited, let's say, way to do justice. However, there is at least one case related to war in Yemen, and this case has to do with European arms trade. The case was made by international and Yemeni NGOs and advocates, lawyers, trying to demand from ICC the investigation to what extent actually the European countries also aiding and into the war crimes in Yemen right now.
Yes, so that's an interesting situation. We see two countries that are both not a member state, so we can't do much in Yemen, we can't do much about what Saudi Arabia is doing, but they say maybe we can see what European countries, if they're delivering arms and they are a member state, maybe we could do something with that. But so far, nothing much has happened with that, has it?
We're still waiting for the response from the ICC. But as Eva said, the process is extremely long.
Yeah.
And so this case was, or the dossier that was, let's say, 350 pages, was submitted in 2018.
So very big file, I'm thinking
exactly,
350
very
pages
big
would be
file,
something like this.
Exactly, and so with lots of details. But until now we haven't have any kind of response.
Still waiting.
Still waiting.
Maybe first let's get a small grasp of the conflict, because I'm not sure if everybody knows what has been going on there. You brought pictures from Al Jazeera. You can see different players in the conflict. And very short, a civil war broke out in Yemen in 2014 when Houthi forces took over the capital city, Sana'a. And the conflict got worse in 2015 when Saudi Arabia also got involved, right?
That's true. But the roots, causes the conflict are much, much deeper, let's say. And almost from the beginning, from the establishment or creation of the Republic of Yemen in 2019, we have the first civil war. It was in 1994. So since then, we already have that multiple conflicts going on in Yemen and many grievances that have never been addressed until now.
Yeah, so it's a very long history of conflict, actually.
It's a history grievances, and the justice has not been done until now. But there were very important efforts related to democratic transition in Yemen that has been taking place after 2011, after the uprising.
Yes, so
in
actually
Yemen.
just before this war started, we had the Arab Spring,
Exactly.
in which many countries demanded a more democratic government, and Yemen was one of them.
Yemen was one of them, and there was a deal between different groups, and Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, stepped down. But the deal, the political transition towards democracy was at expenses, actually, of justice. It means that the deal was that we are going to have peace, or let's have this peaceful transition towards democracy, but the former regime was granted immunity, meaning that at least in Yemen, we would not be able to sue the regime for crimes committed during 33 years of regime.
So talking about justice already at the transition to democracy, it went wrong that the former president, he couldn't be held accountable for what happened before.
The president and all the regime.
Yeah. And I think looking now, many people know the situation in Yemen from stats and things we've seen on TV about the situation people-wise. So many civilian people have suffered from the war. You brought this graph, it's also from Al Jazeera. Do you speak with many people from Yemen at the moment?
Yes, I mean, one of the purpose of my current research is to talk with many activists and refugees that were forced to leave Yemen after the war. And for example, their perception of justice is deeply rooted into their own experiences, and the understanding of justice is also very diverse. I would say like the importance of this comprehensive approach to justice was always highlighted by my research participants, that they were always saying that it's not only important to address individual or state criminal accountability, but also it's important to consider like broader social issues, including gender-based violence, discrimination, and socio-economic inequalities.
So when you speak with people, you mostly speak with women, right?
I speak with women, but also with men. But it's true that my research focuses mostly on women.
And at the moment, also many women who live in exile, so who had to leave Yemen and live abroad now, right?
Yes, but we have to also remember that Yemeni people who live in exile, they still have very important connections to Yemen, and they are still working on Yemen. So they even perceive that it's like their work is like, or let's say that their body maybe is abroad, it's here in the Netherlands, but their soul, their mind is still in Yemen.
So they're very close connected still. And you said when you talk with them about justice and what they would want, they say it's not only about prosecution, but it's about many things.
Yeah, it's the concept of justice is broader, but I think that it's also very important to mention a very important declaration, the Yemen Declaration for Justice and Reconciliation, that actually has been issued as an outcome of Yemen International Forum that was held here in The Hague this year. And it was a gathering of different political actors, different social and political actors who got together to discuss possibilities of reconciliation. And I think
actors from Yemen, or what kind of actors?
Actors from Yemen, but also international experts. But the most important thing that this civil society organizations and also some politicians, they signed the declaration. That called for justice in Yemen, or transition and peace, trying to highlight the importance of addressing past grievances and also the current demands for justice.
So these are different organizations, civil society, but also other organizations that wrote a declaration in which they say they want justice. So what is the power of such a declaration?
So I think it's very important to understand what different civil society organizations want right now in terms of peace process. And they are very clear that the peace cannot be achieved without justice. The fact, what I mentioned before, that the first approach to Yemeni transition, how we could achieve peace without justice, it didn't work. So I think that this is very important declaration, like official declaration.
So if they've seen that before, that after the Arab Spring there was no justice, so they say this time when we transition to peace, we do want people to be held accountable.
Of course.
And what do you think the power of such a declaration will be?
So I think that it's very important to have a common vision of these different civil society organizations. More than 70 organizations signed the declaration. And it's very symbolic, but also it is the power of people, power of saying this is what we want. And especially in the context when we have peace processes, especially track 1 diplomacy, when many actors are completely excluded. So, for example, women, they're excluded from UN-led peace processes, at least at track 1 diplomacy at this,
why are they
at this level. Because the peace processes are fought in a way that only warring parties are invited. And there is this thought that women are not part of the war, but they always say they are part of the solution, they are part of the peace processes. That's why they should be included at the table, at the peace talks, when the very important decisions are taking place.
So your research is especially about this, right? So what if we ask these women what they want, what would they say? And what are they saying?
So I believe that, in terms of peace building, I think that, what is peace for them? Of course, the peace is not only the absence of violence, but it's also of the violence, the direct violence, but the peace is also absence of cultural and structural violence. And I think this is something about the social justice, how we can actually interconnect this peace process with really deep transformation at the social level. Because when we talk about crime, for example, it's not only, the crime is a wound in the society, it's a wound in the community that needs to be healed. And the process is much longer. The process really needs to gather these different actors and work together towards reconciliation, but also towards reconstruction of social cohesion, reconstruction of social tissue that was broken during the war, or was fragmented during the war. So I think this is very important vision that the women also can contribute to.
And do you think sometimes also maybe we demand too much? Like we want peace, but we also want everybody to be prosecuted and we want a more equal structure. Could that be harder to get peace if you have a lot of things you need for that peace?
I think there are also very different levels. So you have this international level and the responsibility of International Criminal Court. You have the state level, and people, of course, they want to have this rule of rule of law and good legal system that they can trust. They can go to the court. We have this community level when we can talk about more traditional and customary justice that in Yemen is extremely important because this is the way how Yemeni people actually try to do justice. They go to the tribal leader, for example, and they ask, to...
So maybe very brief, explain to me, we've got a war going on. Where do people go if they want to get justice for something? You say it's sometimes local, like within a tribal structure, and there is still a national court, or is that not functioning at all at the moment?
I think during the war, like all the institutions collapsed. So it's very difficult to actually do justice or to persecute anybody at national level. But at the same time, I think there are very important initiatives among social or civil society trying to at least document what's going on in Yemen. And this is also the preparation for maybe for the future when we can actually persecute.
Yeah, because we've seen, for example, in Ukraine, it has been very important that we gather a lot of information.
Exactly. So like the documentation of the evidence, the gathering the evidence against the war crimes is important. But also I would say that you mentioned how the people do justice. I mean, in the traditional way, we have a very important customary justice system in Yemen. And this worked very well, and I believe when we talk about the restorative justice, this can be the way when...
And what does it mean, a customer system?
The customer system is based on their own tradition and customs, social norms. So it means that it involves local actors, local leaders, local elders, maybe customary customary practices, where people try to address different kind of harms and heal these wounds.
And in what way is it different? Because it's more direct within the same community, or?
Exactly, it's direct. It's first of all cheaper. It can address needs of the people, direct needs of the people. The question is.
But a lot of harm is done by foreign forces, right? And also.
Yeah, that's why I said that there are very different levels of justice. So of course, when we talk about the foreign aggressors, we can use maybe international criminal court, hybrid courts, national courts in other countries, when we can actually suit different leaders or different states. For example, now I'm thinking about Germany. This is actually a very good example where in Germany, for example, recognized a universal jurisdiction. So it means that there are trials against the Syrian war crimes. So this kind of justice can be done like at this higher level, but also there are this, let's say, individual responsibilities. And in this case, when we talk about harm that was done by neighbor, by a child soldier, by member of your family, it's a very different approach to how we can do justice, because it's not only persecution of all people, let's say, involved in the conflict, the war, in the civil war as well, but it's also about this broken social cohesion and how we can actually rebuild the country, rebuild the communities.
So in this case, for example, if there was a child soldier from a village that would be within this local justice system, how would it punish in such a way that it's still restoring the social cohesion?
I think this is exactly what Yemen Declaration for Justice and Reconciliation considered. So how we can, like, in terms when, I mean, of course, the war need to come to an end, and what will happen after, how we are going to reconstruct the country, and how we are going to work or focus on address the transitional justice. What is transitional justice? I think it's something that Yemeni people have to address and have to also find a way to reconcile. But there are efforts, initiatives, even outside the country, among the diaspora, for example. How we can, the diaspora, I mean people outside Yemen, but also people inside Yemen, how we can reconcile, how we can achieve that national reconciliation. So there are many talks and initiatives that need attention.
Yeah, so in a way focusing on justice, but also focusing on broader things, on restoring the structure of society.
I think it's very important to say that like peacemaking related or peacemaking based on this social justice system is something like the people-to-people diplomacy. And I believe that this is how we can create this safe place to go deep like within like your heart, to allow ourselves to feel vulnerable, but also to be open to others' pain, to recognize the humanity at deepest level. I think this is extremely important, to humanize your adversary. That sometimes it's when you do it, it's harder to hold on to hate.
Thank you. I think we'll go to the audience. Maybe please give a warm applause to Eva. Eva, may I welcome you back on stage? And I'll just walk here to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very fascinating for me to see. I think I would like to address the questions to Ewa. I would like Ewa. Yeah, the talk show one. From what I can understand, that the Yemen devastating condition right now is also influenced by the superpowers in the Middle East, like Iran and Saudi Arabia. How do you see the civil declaration or such thing can also reconcile those two superpowers over there? Meanwhile, if the reconciliation is only happen within the Yemen territory, I think the influence that is right now happening right there is not only at their national level, but also in the regional level. So yeah, I think.
So how to reconcile with big powers?
That's a very good question. That's really a very good question. I think, I mean, it's extremely complex and complicated because we also see like different interests, for example, of Saudi Arabia or Emirates, and they are both in the same coalition, right? So they also have very different vision related to Yemen. Probably now it's difficult to reconcile it, and it makes the perspective of peace in Yemen even much more complex, and that's why the war lasts for such a long time. But on the other hand, I would say that it's also very important international responsibility, and I want to mention something related to the UN Human Rights Council, because actually because of the pressure of Saudi Arabia in 2021, the UN Human Rights Council voted against extending the mandate of a group of eminent experts on Yemen, and this was the only mechanism that was documenting the war crimes in Yemen or the violation of human rights. So I think it's very important also to put much more pressure on international community to do something to stop attacks on civilians, but also to establish this kind of mechanisms to document in official way human rights violation.
Ik heb een vraag over Joegoslavië. For Mrs. Vukušić, okay, in the states of former Yugoslavia, there is peace now, and they have justice systems, and so they should be able to process thousands of cases by their justice systems. So when you make the remark that only a few people can be tried, okay, the worst cases are tried by the ICC, but when person A does something terrible to person B, and they're all from, you know, these few former Yugoslavian states, then they can be tried. Can you clarify this, please?
Yes, of course. I would say that is absolutely true, and trials have been going on in Croatia, and Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Kosovo to different levels of success. And I would say probably something around 800 or 900 people in total have been prosecuted, which now this is a question of is this glass half full or half empty? In comparison to many other conflicts, 800 or 900 people is actually quite a lot of people being prosecuted in different courts. In comparison to some other cases or in comparison to the needs, there's probably 5,000 or 10,000 potential suspects that could be prosecuted. That's probably not enough. So it's a little bit depends how we look at it. Why more aren't being prosecuted? Well, I would say it's probably due to one or two issues. One is political will. So as you can imagine, and I think this is the case in many states across the world, and I think the Netherlands is also not different in that respect, it's very difficult to prosecute your own. So in Croatia, it's very easy to prosecute Serbs. We're the enemy, and it's fairly easy to do that, and there's no political backlash. But once you want to look at the cases of, quote unquote, your own boys, then it becomes politically difficult. We have seen this in the United States, we have seen this in the United Kingdom. Various countries really struggle when it comes to prosecuting our own, so soldiers kind of from our own side. So the political will for that is lacking. Also, there are certain cases in the world of probable war crimes, genocide, or crimes against humanity where there's simply no evidence. For example, let me give you an example of cases of rape, for example, sexual and gender-based violence. Often situations of rape happen without any witnesses present. There's no documents that say go and rape people in this village. Often the survivor, the only thing that they can tell you is like, oh, the guy's name was Brane and he was from Montenegro. You have no idea who Brane is. So there's simply cases where you don't have evidence. And this happens also nationally on our own systems, in organized crime cases and murder cases. Sometimes the murder happens, but we just don't know we just don't know what happened. We have no sufficient evidence. And by now, I think also, and I'll end with this, I think it's also a little bit of an issue that 20, 30 years after the war, the external pressure from other countries to prosecute, attention has moved on. People are looking at Ukraine or Gaza or something else. No one really cares about Bosnia anymore. So Bosnia is feeling less pressure to continue. And this is something that we've seen after the Second World War. Many countries moved on from their Nazi regimes very quickly, let's move on. So I guess those are at least some of the examples why we are not seeing more prosecutions. So you're right, we should be seeing more, but unfortunately, they're still going on, but a lot of the momentum is gone. I hope that helps.
For the left side.
Yeah,
Hi, hello, Eva. I have a question about the peace in Yemen. How can you make peace between different groups? It's not only the groups, also the support of Shiite and Sunnite and maybe another beliefs. How can you make peace between them? I find it complicated.
Well, National Dialogue Conference, I think it was a first and not perfect, but a good first step to achieve that national reconciliation. And in many different issues or many different aspects that were tried to be addressed, different grievances that tried to be addressed during the National Dialogue Conference between 2013 and 2014 were actually quite successful. And this division between Shia and Sunni, it was quite a new phenomenon, and I believe that it's also the part of this social fragmentation that when the different identities got politicized, and we use the religion also as a tool to go deeper into fragmentation and into the society, and use the religion as a tool against other within the community. So I mean, like the difficulty in Yemen that it's not only a civil war. I mean, like Yemenis, at least the Yemenis that I had the pleasure to talk with, they always said, as Yemenis, we know the way how to do justice. We can sit together, we can talk, we have this, let's say, good qualities to establish dialogue between us. The problem is that the war in Yemen it's much more complex because there's this international actors, when you mentioned, involved. So this is what made war difficult, let's say, to solve in easiest way. So I think that it's too many interests right now related to that different international actors, that contradictions that they are still there, and it's very difficult to really find solution when there are not political will to end war in Yemen.
Thank you. Maybe a question for Ms. Vukušić then. You talked about how the ICC is kind of a weak system, but we still value it very much, I think, especially here in the Netherlands and in Europe in general. What is the perception of the global south towards the ICC? Do they see it more and more as just another way of Western interference, or is there some respect to it?
Right, that's a very good question. Part of this is going to be based on my reading of other people's research, because this is not something that I do research. And of course, the label of Global South is such a huge one, right? It attempts to, sort of cover so much ground. I think there is definitely a sense, and we have actually seen this in the situation in Ukraine, and the efforts that have been going on to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. I don't know if some of you have been following that, but Ukraine is a state, and many of its allies, and to a certain extent the Netherlands has been quite supportive there as well, want to establish a separate court for aggression, because for complicated political and legal reasons, the International Criminal Court can't act on the crime of aggression. So what we have seen there is that states that have signed on to this advocacy project are overwhelmingly Western allies, the Baltic states as well, Central European states, Poland, for example, as well. So these are partners. But when one looks at the states that support this effort, it's really clear that African states, Latin American states, Middle Eastern states are not seeing this as something particularly interesting for them to support. So when I was talking about this issue of credibility, I think there are many people in non-Western states that see, the court indicting warlords around Africa, for example, or throwing in a lot of attention, and rightfully so, to the situation in Ukraine. But then they, for example, look at Afghanistan and they hear silence. They hear, about crimes in Iraq and they hear silence. They look at Gaza and they see silence. So I think for many people in those countries, it does seem like the system is not the same for everyone. And so one could say that the support and the enthusiasm for the system, I think, is much stronger here and in Europe, for example, than it is elsewhere. And I think one of the reasons why is that it doesn't target us, does it? So it's easier for us. So I think the critique that comes from the Global South is a loud one, and we can hear it. But thank you, it was a very important question.
Is it a follow-up question?
That's fine.
I disagree. It costs money. It's really the other way around.
Oh, how so?
Well, these African countries have a lot of interest in food, with food price. With food coming out of
no,
Ukraine.
that's true. Yeah, there's something.
They should be interested, but they are not. So it's really the other way around. The Global South is lacking in responsibility. And
that's right. No, that is an argument that people present. I personally disagree, and it's totally fine for us to disagree. Gatherings like this are for the exchange of opinions and arguments. I understand that you very rightfully point to the fear of certain states to be in an argument, quote unquote, with Russia because of course, the supply of food and grain. But the skepticism, so to say, of the Global South toward the ICC predated Ukraine. Many years before the invasion, the full-scale invasion ever started, many critics said, you're jumping onto all of these cases in Africa, but you're not jumping onto Afghanistan, are you? So I'm not discounting your argument. I think there's absolutely something to it, but the skepticism from the Global South predates the situation with Russia and Ukraine.
Eva, maybe you could say something about that the ICC has also issued an arrest warrant against Putin. That was quite exceptional, right?
Yes, it was exceptional in many different ways. One, I would say this was the first time that the prosecutor issued an arrest warrant against a president of what is broadly considered to be a very powerful state. They're on the UN Security Council, they're a nuclear power as well. So in many ways, it was exceptional. It remains to be seen what will ever happen with that, if anything. But I think there's also now critique that many people from across the world are saying, well, you know, when it was about Russia and Ukraine, the International Criminal Court's prosecutor came out with an arrest warrant like a month and a half after the full-scale invasion started. And in some other cases, for Afghanistan, they conducted a investigation for 10 years. And after 10 years, they said, well, we're not going to touch it. Same critique goes for the situation in Gaza and the operations from late 2009, 2014. It takes the longest time to investigate some cases, and in some other cases, boom, in six weeks, we have an indictment. So the optics of that are not great. And I think some of the criticism also is about this sort of timing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the informative overview. I would like to take the question to a more of a creative space, and I also would like to invite.
Let's try it.
Yes.
Yes. So from what I gather, the situation is a bit meek in terms of the international courts and international justice system. And then the question is, just like as a fantasy, if we imagine the perfect world or something, like what would we actually need as a planet to have an effective and powerful system without thinking of like, you know, like one government war
I get it.
like within the context, so something still realistic and
Right.
not,
Something
not
halfway.
sci-fi.
Yeah.
Something I can start, and maybe you can also think about it a little bit, because I'd be curious to hear what you think. So a little bit imaginative, but not full on out of this world. I would say one thing that would definitely help with reforming the UN. The fact that we have the United Nations Security Council with 5 states that have a veto is not good, because they can send cases, situations to the ICC, or they can stop them. They can say to the court, now stop, wait, this is a danger for peace and justice, or justice and security. So I think that would go a long way in equaling the playing field a little bit. So I think that would be a good start. A good start, I think, which is still in the realm of possible and reachable, would be to invest much more in prevention. So what we would call upstream action. So instead of waiting for things to go wrong and all this violence to take place, to try to act earlier. So in the former Yugoslavia, for example, several months before things took a wrong turn, there were signs that things are taking the wrong turn. So instead of constantly, fighting fires, to try to take away people's matches, or try to have some incentives to be, well, instead of this, how about this? So to try to act in a way that prevents at least some of the violence into blowing up into kind of full scale. I think those two things, given that the situation is bleak, are still fairly unachievable at the moment, but would be imaginable as a course of action that I think would bring good returns.
Ewa, would you like to add?
Well, I think I would agree with you, especially in terms of double standards. And I feel that it's very important to also address this point, like how we can put pressure or reform the system in a way that actually we put in the center the human rights rather than political interest of different countries. And this would be a big step forward to change, let's say, the world.
Thank you. I had another question here.
Yeah, I have a question actually to each of one of you. For Eva, what is actually the situation in Yemen for a layman? Who is fighting and what are the interests of the external parties that you mentioned? And for Eva, why is the US not part of the ICC? Was it because they are afraid that their presidents would be constantly sued? And would the Iraq war constitute such a case that would be in front of this? And can't we, as Western powerful countries, not pressure other countries like the US, like China, like Russia into becoming members by waging sanctions or restricting visas from China, especially, for example?
Right.
Two good questions. Maybe, Ewa, I can put the slide one back so we can see the map again.
Do you mind if I just take a pen?
I thought let's save this question for the discussion because it is a hard one, but it's good you mention it. Maybe could you
Yes, I don't want to go to the details because it's really the situation is quite complex. But I would only add that these different countries, different Saudi Arabia or Emirates, on Iran, they support different groups in Yemen. So Iran supports the Houthis, the rebels from the north that actually occupy very important parts of Yemen, the northern parts of Yemen, where the majority of the population live. And this is why sometimes we also talk about that rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran supporting the Shia groups and Saudi Arabia, in this case, international recognized government, but also, let's say that component, the religious component, was weaponized in this case. Saudi Arabia, let's say, support the international recognized government, but there is also like the part of the coalition, the Emirates, or that support the Southern movement, the Southern Transitional Council. It's a council that demanded the separation from the northern part of Yemen. So they are, let's say, the separatist movement that claim the right to self-determination and establishment of a separate state. So I believe it's also like we have the economic interest, we have political interest, who controls what in Yemen. So I think that this three different countries, of course, they have. They play a very important role in the conflict. But also there are other countries like US or European countries. There were fewer, potentially, they're involved in a conflict in indirect way, but also playing a very important part in the conflict in terms of, for example, the arms trade. And we know that war is a good business. So I believe that I will give you one example from Spain, where in 2018 we have a minister of defense who canceled some laser bombs, selling the laser bombs to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi Arabia threat that they are going to cancel another deal related to ships for Saudi Navy that were supposed to be produced in Cadiz in Spain. And what happened was that the Spanish people took the streets in protest because they were so worried of losing their jobs. And so finally the politicians, the Spanish politicians, they had to decide between, as they said, between peace and bread. And they, of course, they decided to continue with the arms trade because of economic interest, but also because of the interest of their own voters, their own the workers, the Spanish workers. So this economic component, I think, in the conflict and how we can contribute to the war in indirect way, it's also very important, and sometimes it's invisible.
And Eva, one of the main things, Eva, sorry, we see on TV is that a lot of people do not have access to enough food. Which of the actors is causing this?
The starvation. Mm-hmm. It's it's a very good point. I mean, since the starvation is also recognized as a war crime, I feel that. There are also different organizations that already were documenting how Saudi-led coalition were deliberately causing starvation in Yemen by, for example, bombarding and targeting objects directly related to food supply or the water supply. So, for example, farms, fishing industry, medical centers, food distribution places. So all this, of course, contributed to hunger or the famine in Yemen.
And that is done by Saudi Arabia, or which parties? Both?
No, it is both. It's both sides, the Saudi-led coalition, but also the Houthi rebels. So I believe that, all crimes in Yemen are committed by all warring parties.
All right, and then Eva, there was a question.
Yeah, it's a really big question. We can be talking about this for potentially for an hour or more. But let me just very briefly say why big states in the United States is, of course, one of them. Is because they're engaged in many different places in the world, doing all kinds of things, historically doing things that would land them, or at least some of their citizens, in a court if there were courts that had jurisdiction for that. So, for example, the United States very much considers themselves to be exceptional, and then believes that it would be targeted unfairly. That's sort of the line. And I think this goes for other powerful states as well. China is one example, Russia. So important states indeed, several of them are not member states. What can we do? I don't think that many of these important big states are necessarily very afraid of what each individual smaller state would do, for example, the Netherlands. But one thing that I think we definitely as a state could and should be doing is pointing out the hypocrisy. So, for example, officials from the United States are very, very vocal about the need to achieve justice in relation to Ukraine, and rightfully so, because there are indeed many crimes, at least prima facie, at least it seems like there are indeed many, many crimes committed on a systematic level. One thing that our government, we as citizens, journalists, advocates could be saying is every time an American official has a statement about the importance of prosecuting Putin, to say, sign the Rome Statute, sign the Rome Statute, sign the Rome Statute, and just keep saying that. Because it's hypocritical to demand and expect the treatment of a certain state by the system and inviting the system to act on a certain state and yet not wishing to submit yourself to the same system. So again, it comes to this idea of legitimacy and double standards, where all our partners, allies, and friendly states, we should be telling them, Ukraine also didn't sign the Rome Statute. We're also helping Ukraine very much. We should be insisting that everyone signs the Rome Statute. So I think that is one small thing, but I think an important thing to be insisting that if you want to speak about justice, sign the Rome Statute. I think that could be a start.
What about Iraq 2003? Would the consider
So normally it works in a way that once you sign to the court, that is when the jurisdiction starts. So you can't go back.
If they had signed it then?
Well, the International Criminal Court doesn't deal with the reason of the invasion. It's a complicated legal story, so it doesn't deal with the invasion itself, but the violations committed by Americans, which I think have been broadly documented, that there are several instances like that, then the court indeed would have jurisdiction.
There's one question from someone watching online. Sham Khaled, he says, as a Yemeni, I appreciate you shedding a light on the situation in Yemen. I have two questions. And the first one is, if the transitional justice takes place within the local norms of Yemen, for example, death penalty to those who have killed, would the West accept the measures or would they try to influence it? Hard question.
Well, it is. I don't know. I cannot say what the West would do. I mean, like, the West is also a very broad concept. But I fear that at least when we talk about UN, there is a very big change in terms of even terminology or using the terminology. Now, when we talk about the peace process, it's the Yemeni-led peace process, not a UN-led peace process. So I believe that there is a very important significant narrative saying that the Yemeni people should decide about the future, the Yemeni people should decide how they see the transitional justice. Yemeni people, like this, I would say, even transfer of responsibility towards the Yemeni people. When the Yemeni people say, but we still need your support in many cases. For example, when we talk about the women's political participation, in the last meeting that I participated with one of the UN officer from the special envoy to Yemen, there was this was the demand from Yemeni people saying, we need actually also your intervention, your support, your very strong voice of international community to achieve, to support towards our needs and demands, because there are certain structures that without the support of the international community, it's very difficult to break this cycle.
So it might be hard to do both, to ask assistance and apply local norms.
I think that it's very important to hold accountable all responsible parts, and of course the Yemeni people should decide about their future, and without intervention of Western countries. But on the other side, also international community has kind of responsibility and should support the processes designed by Yemenis itself.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for the second question later, but first here was a question as well.
Yes, I read about the fact that the prosecutor's office of the ICC plans to join investigations in Libya, which concern human rights violations against migrants and refugees, amongst others. And I wanted to catch up on this question about Western states and how their responsibility could play a role. Do you see any chance that maybe also the role of Mediterranean European states would be taken into account in these investigations?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, maybe.
Right, yeah. So the International Criminal Court's prosecutor gets submissions from civil society or kinds of organizations that want to bring attention to something. It's basically saying, dear prosecutor, please look at this. Here is a set of claims that we're making. Here are some footnotes. Here is some evidence. Please look at it. We think that it fits your jurisdiction. We have seen, I think, submissions. I think they come in the hundreds every year from different places around the world. I believe several years ago there were submissions made about sexual abuse in the church. There were submissions made about migration and sort of the role of Frontex, for example. So all of these things are things that are sent to the prosecutor. We don't know what the prosecutor does really with them. Sometimes they reply after 3 years and sometimes longer, or so we don't have a lot of insight. There's an office that accepts and receives all of them, but we don't really know what happens. The International Criminal Court has not yet dealt with things that relate to human rights abuses as they relate to irregular migration. I would be fairly surprised if anything happened there. First of all, because I think the prosecutor may see it as a bit outside of the realm of the defined crimes as they are, even though I think these advocates are making the claim that these are crimes against humanity because it's at such a scale that we can't ignore it. But I think the prosecutor might see it as this is maybe awful, but it's maybe not for us. And also, again, targeting high-level officials from Frontex. I mean, I just don't see that happening.
I've got space for one last question and a very brief answer.
Thank you. What about the peace talks brokered by China between Saudi Arabia and Yemen in the beginning of 2023? Did that bring about anything, or that was just a stretch?
No, it had. It played very important role. I mean, like currently, there are also regional peace talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebels, and these diplomatic channels were able actually to be open because of the deal mediated by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So of course, I think that it was one of the most important efforts that open new possibilities, not necessarily the possibilities that the civil society would like to see, because the civil society is completely excluded from these regional talks between the Houthi rebels and Saudi Arabia. And I believe that the declaration actually that I mentioned before, signed by the reconciliation, Declaration for Justice and Reconciliation, signed by a civil society organization, is also kind of feedback or kind of response towards the regional talks where most of the actors are excluded. Even the international recognized government is not part of this negotiations between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. So again, the Yemeni conflict became even more complex right now.
Thank you so much. We've come to an end of the evening, and before I ask for one more applause to our two guests of tonight, I've got a question for all of you. It was very great to have you all participating tonight. I really enjoyed your questions as well. I think it's a very nice audience to have this conversation with. We always like to know how you experienced the evening, so what you've learned tonight, maybe if you got some new ideas, maybe if you have some advice for us. So if you could all take out your phone, if you have it with you, and scan this QR code, we would be very happy to receive your feedback. And maybe while you're doing that, I could tell something about that this was our last event of the season. We'll be back to you in February with a new season of lectures. And if you are not a part of our newsletter yet, you could go to our website. That's www.sg.uu.nl. And there you can sign up to our newsletter, and then you get monthly updates with our program. I see a lot of people are scanning. I'm very happy. Thank you so much. But first, let's give a very warm applause for our two guests of tonight. Thank you so much.